Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Carolinas Cornets mega event. Virtually, we appreciate you joining us. And I should say good morning or good evening, depending on what continent you're on. You are part of our original kickoff here of a virtual series of mega event sessions. This topic is around CRE around the world with our focus on Asia Pacific. So I'd like to just give you a few housekeeping rules associated with what we're doing. You are being recorded, so we would like you to self-mute if possible. We are going to have some roundtable conversation for about 20 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions to each of you. At that time, you can either raise your hand in the chat portion of the session here today, or you can put your question in. Please be specific to who you'd like to ask that question to if you have that in mind. Now, I'd like to also thank all of our sponsors for the event. So if we could show who those sponsors are, I would greatly appreciate it. Great. Our diamond sponsors are CBRE, DPR Construction, and JLL. And then we have our annual sponsors for Cornet, who we greatly appreciate all of your sponsorship from Diamond, Platinum, and Gold membership. We also have some very special sponsors specific to our mega event this year, so we'd like to recognize them. And most specifically, we would like as our sponsor for this session, which is CBRE. So let's listen to them briefly and have a few minutes for them.
Hi, I'm John Christenberry with CBRE. CBRE is a proud diamond sponsor for the Carolinas Cornet chapter, a global award-winning Cornet chapter. CBRE is the world's largest commercial real estate services and investment firm with more than 100,000 employees globally. In the Carolinas alone, we have more than 900 professionals who have local expertise in nearly every industry from banking, retail, healthcare, life sciences, data centers, logistics, manufacturing, provide specific expertise and advice that enables our clients to develop, manage, and exceed organizational goals for their real estate portfolios. Our clients include 95% of the Fortune 100, including Carolinas-based clients like Bank of America, Truist Financial, Wells Fargo, Electrolux, just to name a few. We would greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about how CBRE can bring real advantage to your businesses through the real estate and investment services we offer.
Great. Thanks to our sponsors and thanks, John. We're going to get to see John live here in just a second because I'm going to turn it over to both John Christenberry and Brad Divins, who are going to moderate our panelists for this discussion. Gentlemen.
Thank you. This is Brad Divins, and I have the distinct pleasure this evening, to introduce the three panelists that we'll talk with today. First up is Shelley Boland, the Managing Director and Regional Head of Property with Standard Chartered Bank. Alex Barnes, Executive Director and Head of Markets, located in Hong Kong for JLL. And John Sellery, the Group Managing Director with M. Moser & Associates. Give me a warm welcome and saying thank you for them to join today's event. Virtual play. John, over to you.
Hi, Shelley. Why don't you mind just introducing yourself, your role with the company, and then we'll go to Alex and then John.
Great. Well, good morning to our colleagues in the US. Good evening to my fellow colleagues in Asia. Thank you for the kind introduction, Brad. My name's Shelley Boland. I'm based in Hong Kong, the regional head for property for Standard Chartered Bank. And also wearing my Cornet hat, I am the chair for the Hong Kong chapter for Cornet Global.
Alex?
Thanks. Alex Barnes. I run markets in Hong Kong for JLL, which is essentially all the landlord and tenant rep transactional business, and also sit on our global office leasing board.
John.
Thanks, Alex. Shelley, my name's John. I've been based in Hong Kong the last 30 years. I oversee our global business for Moser. I'm currently stuck in the United States due to COVID, but I'm involved with our offices across the world and spend a ton of my time working with our offices in Asia and our clients in Asia.
We're excited to have all three on our panel discussion today. Can't wait to see what's occurring over in Asia. I always view Asia, not only are they ahead of us in time, but they're ahead of us in dealing with COVID and a lot of the real estate challenges that are associated with it. So we're going to start off with a broker-led question for you, Alex. So Alex, what's the current state of the market? Paint us a picture, because the past couple of years, at least here in America, it's been a very landlord-favorable market where they dictated terms, concessions were not as great as they were at the beginning of the bull cycle. Has the scale tilted back to the tenant yet?
Yeah, so big question for Asia Pac, and certainly very wide-ranging question given each of the different markets. And while my focus is Hong Kong, I'll try and give you a flavor for major markets and where they are at, which is really dependent upon cities, the state of lockdowns, whether they are government instructed or not, and how far they've come back from the first, second, or third wave of infections. So markets like China, for example, have been back in the office for months now. And for the most part, if we take Shanghai, for example, they have been back in the market back since about Easter now, and all guns blazing with respect to transactions. If you look at Hong Kong, I mean, we have been in and out of about 3 waves already, and transactional activity has been pretty slow, certainly from the sort of mid-tier of the market. India is an example of a market that is somewhat holding up. So I think when a lot of multinationals look at India, they feel like the market should be in a free fall due to COVID and quite a substantial amount of lockdown. The fact of the matter is that landlords have worked really hard with tenants to satisfy immediate concerns like rebates and restructures. And a lot of deals that were negotiated in Q4 of last year or Q1 of this year have really held up to the market and closed out in the middle of this year and in Q3. An example of that would be BlackRock, who closed a 200,000 square foot deal in Mumbai. That having been negotiated pre-COVID, has really held up to the fiscal terms that were negotiated prior to them. The landlord has offered a little bit of extra rent free to satisfy some of the risks around the build out of that and getting people back on site. But ultimately, we haven't seen much of a softening in headline rental terms. If you look at Singapore has been in a government mandated lockdown since April. What are we now, Tuesday? So yesterday was the first day that a lot of companies went back 50-50. So 50% of the people in the office this week and 50% going back next week. So the market there is yet to see really any transactional activity since April to really determine which way the market's moving there. Australia, varying parts of Australia have been in quite strict lockdowns. Melbourne, capital of Victoria, has been a pretty strict lockdown. Haven't been a lot of deals done. So essentially, is it a tenant market? Yes, in Hong Kong, absolutely has swung into a tenant favorable market after a bull market that has essentially run for about 10 or 15 years. But it's a general no across most of APAC. And that's really a supply-demand balance. In a market like Hong Kong, we're lucky we don't have a huge amount of supply, but we're already 20% down on rents. But that transactional change was already coming at us before COVID even hit. And we're somewhat lucky there's not a lot more space. For most other markets, there hasn't been enough transactional data to confirm how much that market has swung. And ultimately, so many deals have been put on hold. Now that may be a precursor to which way those markets move into, whether it's becomes much more favorable tenant market. And ultimately, we're seeing landlords, depending upon where they are, slowly move the needle. In Hong Kong and China, we're probably sort of 4 to 6 months ahead of a lot of the rest of the region with respect to the flexibility that you otherwise couldn't get for the last 10 or 15 years. And I understand from my colleagues around the region, particularly in Australia, that's just starting to happen. So hopefully that sort of answers the broad question of whether we're in a tenant market or not. I mean, I think ultimately we're almost in a tenant market, but depending upon the market, we're not quite there. Probably just 3 overarching themes that may So to sum up what we're seeing, not just in Asia Pac, but perhaps a little wider as well, deals are being delayed wherever possible, small to mid-sized transactions. Transactional volume everywhere is markedly down in APAC. Secondly, large requirements continue to press ahead. They tend to be supply dictated and probably something that you see globally and not just in APAC. And lastly, and I'm sure John Sellery will talk to this, all occupiers are really trying to consider what their future presence looks like moving forward, be that design, questions on hub and club, flexible leases, and of course, what does the world's biggest work from home experiment mean moving forward?
Right.
Great, Alex. I think that's a great overview.
Perfect answer.
Great. Sorry, I think I was talking over you. Sorry about that, John. So, Alex teed it up quite nicely, and I think, moving on to John with M. Moser. John, one of the things I think as you look at the kind of the market and what we're looking at today, a lot of folks are talking about social distancing and how the change of the layout of the space is going to be. I think the million-dollar question with regard to design seems to be what changes can we expect in a post-COVID world? So as you've been designing the spaces, and what do you think are the changes from the way we've been designing space in a post-COVID world?
Right. Thanks, Brad. Well, first, I think we can't see Asia as a monolithic environment. They're really different environments, different cultures, and very different responses to this. So if I look at Hong Kong, for example, many of our clients are speaking to us about the opportunity to reduce space. One of our insurance clients is going to give up space and just densify. Very few are actually talking about, in Hong Kong at least, about reducing density. What they are speaking to us about is improving the quality of the buildings. So we're doing a lot of work as it relates to MEP systems. We are increasing collaboration environments in these spaces, but it's a falling market. And so, as Alex said, it's a wait and see for most of our clients. And I think most people associate the fact that there's no movement with COVID. And in fact, every falling market in the last 32 years I've been there, there's been no movement. People wait for it to start to rise. If I look at China, it's pretty much back to normal. Density is the same, and so much of that is cultural. But what has changed, or what hasn't continued, is an immense desire to improve the quality. So WELL is something that's probably embraced more in China than anywhere else in any of our markets. So in fact, I would say that for many of our clients, the healthiest spaces that their people exist in during a 24-hour day is their office space.
Yeah.
If I look at Singapore, Singapore is beginning to, I should say both Hong Kong and Singapore are both talking about reducing space, at the opportunity to reduce space. We'll see whether or not that actually happens, but there is a lot of conversation about it. In both those markets, Hong Kong and Singapore, many of the landlords are coming to us, and we're now designing 3 what we would call third spaces, where landlords, and they're not really co-working environments, but they certainly form a function similar to that. But because of shift working, as Alex mentioned, a lot of people would like to go into the office or have a need, but they can't go in for that week. And so the landlords are providing alternative space for them. So we have 3 fairly substantial projects on the boards right now for landlords in those markets. In India, we've got a couple of million square feet on the boards in India at the moment. And virtually all of them, those projects were paused for a moment while we studied social distancing and changing space standards, introducing a lot of the health measures that we hear about in the United States. And after about a month of studies, virtually all those clients had said, forget it, we're just going to go back to the way it was. I think the research that we've done in India, which is a fair bit, what we found is about 65% of people, and that's across industries, so it's a generalization, but roughly 65% of our Indian clients, people, would like to continue home working in some form. I think it's challenging for many of them in that environment because one, their homes don't support it very well, bandwidth is poor. So we'll see whether or not it reaches that magnitude, but I'd say for a day or two a week, that's quite possible. But we've not yet seen our clients looking to reduce space or even chase space standards. Manila is very much like India, and that's a BPO environment. So one of the challenges they've had with home working in Manila, because they've had a lot of lockdown and pretty strenuous, has been security for the BPO environments. And so there've been a lot of breaches. So they're anxious to get everyone back into the office as soon as possible. And I don't foresee a lot of change in the way that workplace functions. In Australia, very similar to the West. I mean, they haven't really started to take many actions yet, but they are talking about the opportunity of reducing space, creating much more shared environments, much more collaboration, much more innovation focused. And we're seeing that, interestingly enough, in our conversations with clients across the spectrum. We're seeing it not only, in fact, we're doing some biotech work right now in Australia, pharmaceutical work, and they actually are embracing home working as well. And so in an environment with labs, a lot of the scientists are preferring to do their focused work at home and coming into the office for the lab work and some of the innovation work. So that surprised us a little bit.
Yeah, especially given the industry. Well, John, thank you for the update. I mean, I think that's really a good thing from our point of view in terms of the way in which space is going to be changing over the course of the next course of the future, especially from a post-COVID world. I want to shift briefly now to Shelley and, think about that, with that kind of tee up. I think one of the questions really, when you look at the larger companies around the world today, Shelley, being as an end user, one of the things to kind of look at is, not only is space changing, but also how much are you taking? What's your work life going to be like? Companies in the technology industry seem to be taking up space in really large chunks and making commitments to markets. But then in the other side of things, you have companies like Twitter who just are going to go with a virtual workplace. How is your company approaching real estate in the APAC region?
Thanks, Brad, for the question. I think just before I start, I'm aware that the Standard Chartered presence in the Americas is probably not as familiar to some. So just for some context, Standard Chartered employs around 90,000 plus employees globally. Very much our business is pivoted towards Asia Pacific, with a strong presence in the emerging markets in Africa and the Middle East, and then corporate businesses based in the Americas and Europe. I think you'll also, if you've traveled, you may notice our strong retail presence with almost 900 plus branches around the world, particularly focused again on Africa, Middle East and Asia. I was looking at some data today actually, and the bank has managed in the first 9 months or so of the year to run the organisation at times with 80+% of our staff not in the office, which I suppose, be careful what you wish for as a head of real estate, because this has very much accelerated our flexible working agenda. So to your question, I'll just focus on the office part for your question, Brad. But Standard Chartered continues very much towards its long-term goals to increase activity-based working and provide choice for our employees. I think what has been profiled even more in the last particularly 9 months is that workplace experience. And that's whether you are within the Standard Chartered premises or you are working remotely, that experience needs to still be exceptional. And clearly there is a commercial lens around any end user at the moment. And therefore we need to be very creative in terms of releasing that underutilized space So it's music to my ears as Alex, for the first time in many years, tells me it's a tenant's market. And obviously, cost is a factor as we go into what could be some challenging headwinds. For us, we very much focus, to answer your question, around how we're approaching real estate in APAC and more broadly across the portfolio. We focus sort of on 4 key areas. Obviously, we want to accelerate, you know, the future of work. It's here now, as opposed to something that seemed to be in a distance. I think for us, this actually means that we're going to be more of a hybrid solution. We want to have an opportunity to bring our teams together to promote culture and collaboration. We don't particularly look at a home worker label. It's very much around this hybrid and flex approach. We want to make sure that when you are in the office, you have activity-based opportunities, and working with, you know, companies like John, with Moser, we're able to really create collaboration meeting spaces, you know, to be more reflective of the activity when you do come to the office. It's more appropriate. Again, I think our IT colleagues have had an accelerated experience in the last, you know, particularly 9 months. We're investing heavily in technology to enable virtual collaboration. Many of the tools that this team on the call will be quite familiar. And again, probably brought, you know, the bring your own device and flexibility agenda to the forefront, whereas previously it may have been a lower priority. And then ultimately, working with partners like Alex and the broker network, how do we monetize our true surplus space? But obviously, we're seeing across APAC very mixed market conditions. And we also need to future-proof our portfolio. We need to ensure that we're building in flexibility so that when activity does return, which we're confident it will, we also haven't put ourselves in a position where we find ourselves unable to support the business activity. So very much looking at the most appropriate core and flex model when it comes to square footage.
Great.
That's a ton
Thank
of
you for that.
challenges that you're facing. I'd be curious what Brad's facing as well in the Americas, and we'll get to that here on Thursday. But I'll flip it over to Alex. That's Shelley's response is a good segue. Alex, you know, this is a challenge I'm having with clients that have lease expirations that might be up in the next 12 to 18 months. How are you advising your clients? Because it seems to be a bit of a mixed bag over here, where some are kicking the can down the road and some are taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah, no different to APAC and Hong Kong. Everybody, all tenants have looked at their leases. Everyone's gone for that sprint to savings and looked to see whether they can hive off space, surrender sublet. Everybody's run really, really hard at that. For those businesses that have got maybe 12 or lease expiries or events in 6, 12 or 18 months, many of them are choosing to take shorter term transactional activity to get through the current situation, be that another 12 months, which has typically been really hard to get in places like Hong Kong and Australia as well, where leases are often 3 or 5 year intervals. But there's been a lot more flexibility. So we're advising clients really not to rush. I think that there has been some really positive reactions to what's happening, and it sounds like Shelley's really nailing it around that accelerated future of work. I think what we probably can, well, certainly internally, we see that in 2 or 3 years' time, as business starts to come back, then the office will take on another form. Some things will have accelerated, but absolutely the office will remain a core part of businesses. And Brad mentioned Twitter, and we hear a lot of this out of the US, and not to step on the toes of the US, but we're also hearing on the sidebar that a lot of these big companies are separately looking at how they design for purpose to bring people back to do the sorts of thing that Shelley mentioned before, which is, you know, basically bringing the right space so that when people come back to the office, they have a space where they can actually carry out that purpose for that particular day. There are a lot of organizations who are grabbing a hold of work from home as well. So again, that really comes back to being perhaps a little, in a place like Hong Kong, to put work from home into context in Hong Kong, the average size of the family home here is less than 400 square feet. I believe it's the smallest family, average family living quarters in, well, let's say first tier markets, by a considerable margin as well. So work from home for a lot of your workers can look like conference calls from the bathroom. So it's a little bit difficult to make that a long time solution. So it does work for quite a lot of people. And Shelley put it quite rightly. It's not necessarily work from home, it's work from a third party space, and they are popping up. John talked about what he's doing with with landlords in Hong Kong as well. So I think there are a couple of clients that we know who are looking at enforcing work from home for 1 or 2 days a week, which is really that commercial component Shelley spoke about. In the world's most expensive office market for a CBD, Hong Kong, it's actually really critical to try and eke out some of those savings to get to that pipeline in the future of 2 or 3 years' time, when hopefully Hong Kong and the rest of APAC and the rest of the world finds its economic feet again.
That's super interesting, especially given the size of the average size of the home. It doesn't really afford you the opportunity to work from home the way a lot of suburban US would. That's great insight. I appreciate it, Alex. For John, when we start talking about short-term decisions with leases, with COVID, there's been a lot of discussion around how to plan space. Are people really willing at this time to make long-term decisions based on the short-term impacts of social distancing? Are you finding clients are willing to spend that type of capital on these distancing requirements to incorporate in their space?
Yeah, good question. No, we're not seeing social distancing being maintained as a long-term solution in space. So there are strategies that we're developing with clients so that when the next epidemic hits or the next business disruption hits that requires that sort of solution, there is a way to deal with that both operationally as well as physically. But generally, I think people feel, we've all seen that at the beginning there was this euphoria, the honeymoon stage of working from home, and people were surprised at how well it worked. But at that point, the social connection was still maintained, and it broke down everywhere over a period of time. And so this desire to get back to the office is really returned. And I think Alex and Shelley both touched on the fact that people want to come back to a slightly different environment. They want to come back to an environment that they know is safer, that supports the work that they do. And so there are those types of decisions being made, but they're being made mostly by organizations who have projects on the boards. As Alex had mentioned earlier, some of our clients that were closing deals at the end of the fourth quarter last year are making those types of decisions now. But if they have the luxury of waiting, they're certainly waiting. And we're exploring many, many options for them in that wait process. But if they can delay a decision for long-term action, they will.
Great. Thank you, John, for that. And I think it, really brings us to our group of questions here with Shelley and trying to close out this initial set. When you think about the culture of an organization, Standard Chartered, like any other organization, has a culture in the office, and in this COVID world, everything is virtual. So there's this thought process around: are we losing culture? Is there a culture that's that we need to be planning for? From a virtual point of view, and what do we think culture is going to look like in the future? So, how are you or Standard Chartered maintaining culture in this virtual world, and what do you think that's going to be with new employees coming into this kind of environment?
Look, it's a good question. I think that's where all panelists have sort of touched on the fact that a community space that you can get together, be it an office or another form, is is not going to go away. I think for us, the culture is key, and we continue to invest in virtual platforms and also provide additional care to new joiners who are on board, to help them understand the Standard Charter values and culture. It's hard when your first day on the job is actually in your living room. So how do you get the pulse of the organisation from what is a unique environment? So very much in partnership with HR, our onboarding process at the moment, we're sort of in hypercare mode. Especially if you're starting in a quarantine type environment, to make sure that you've got the essentials and that you can connect quickly to our virtual world. Where communication is key around wellness, safety, security, and very much helping people mobilize with our suite of technology products. I think the other thing is that we're using a lot more different mediums to connect, whether it's video, whether it's these type of platforms, but I think we're trying to create more of a visual connection, and again, so people can feel the pulse of the organisation and pick up on that culture. The other area that we've focused a lot on is clearly in the future, our workforce may need to have different skills, and we want to take the opportunity to retool and launch very much a number of personalised training programs, again, so people can continue to build out their experience within the bank and a chance to keep reconnecting with our core values and culture. I've touched on the digital tools, but also at the core of everything we do, well-being is number one. Our staff and our clients and our broader community, safety is number one, and that's core to our culture. So that's where I think we're very much looking at the physical environment. We've partnered with a global organisation to provide online fitness and activities at your fingertips. We've made sure that we've kept very much social connections, with even bringing in motivational speakers for our staff and helping to become more resilient in these extraordinary times. We've got a very strong employee assistance program because we're conscious that this can be a troubling time in terms of stress, and very much we're here for you in terms of our cultural mantra. And then obviously at times this can be difficult financially for people in terms of business and support. And so again, we're providing a lot of resourcing and counselling to really round out that well-being cultural lens, which I think is going to be, at the core of how our business maintains and builds opportunities through this next 6 months plus.
Yeah. Shelley, that's incredible. The amount of resources that your bank is dedicated to culture in a virtual setting, because you hear the stories of kids not having the ability to go and interact with their classmates and things like that, and there being depression tied to that. And I don't think that it's any different in the adult world. And the fact that you're taking an active stance in it is wonderful. I'm gonna, we purposely left this panel discussion capped at a certain number of folks, because we really wanted this to be a roundtable discussion. So we're encouraging everyone. You'll have the ability to either type in your question, and we can ask it directly to Shelley, Alex, or John. Or if you wanted to ask a question yourself, just shoot a note to the chat and say, "Hi, I have a question," and you can direct it straight to them. And while that occurs, I'll fire off the first question to John Sellery. John, you made a comment on density in Hong Kong. You don't see that really changing in space planning, at least yet, and moving forward. What is the average square foot per person you see in a city like Hong Kong? Whether it be 150 square feet to 185 square feet, do you have a number that is almost a standard maybe it's based on the industry, but I'm curious, what is that number?
Sorry, John, were you asking me that question? You
Yep.
broke up. Yeah. Yeah, well, it does vary by industry quite considerably, but I think most people think about 100 square feet per person, but that's on the net. So Hong Kong and Asia thinks square footage on the net as opposed to the lettable or the gross, which a lot of the world does. So it's a very efficient number in that sense. But a rule of thumb for many organizations would be about 100. It used to be, some organizations are lower and some are larger. The building code of Hong Kong, it's actually a law. The minimum amount of space is 9 square meters a person in an office environment. And so that's roughly what organizations try to achieve.
Understood. And that's, even on the net is a pretty dense work environment compared to the US.
Indeed. And it's, the market's so different because, for example, density is actually managed by landlords, not by the government. So it's the landlord that's responsible for ensuring that their tenants don't overpopulate their buildings.
Interesting. So not building code.
Well, the building code is a guidance, but interiors environments are not submitted for permit in Hong Kong, unless you're making a structural change or something to that nature. So as a result, the landlords have a responsibility to ensure that these standards are met, and you can imagine that they're fairly flexibly enforced.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Blake Martin has a question. Are we able to unmute Blake?
Hey, can you hear me, John?
Yep.
Perfect. John Sellery, thank you guys. Thank all three of you for joining today. John, my question is directly for you. So I work in the healthcare industry and developer and landlord myself. And curious, as you're talking about office space and you're talking about densities for users, what are you seeing, or have you seen any comments about what consumers might expect? So as our patients are coming back in, or people who maybe, and maybe Shelley, you can talk to this too. What are your customers expecting when they come back in to do business in your respective client offices or in your bank?
That's a great question. Again, it varies a little bit by market, but the landlords are beginning to implement very strict controls. So, in Hong Kong and in Singapore and many of these environments, no one's been afraid to give away their fingerprint. So our identity cards in Hong Kong have all that data. It makes moving through immigration very simply, but it also allows for landlords in some markets to begin to control them using identity cards of that nature. And so in China, for example, they're going to be able to tell as you enter a building who you are, what your temperature is, if you've been associated or next to others with COVID. This type of data is becoming available. Of course, China's even beginning to use facial recognition in this regard. And so, the Chinese would argue that the cultural differences are so immense. It's hard to understand. If you look at China for a moment, the we is bigger than the I. The individual's first name is their family name, and then the generational name, and then the individual name. Addresses begins with the country, the city, the district, then the street, then the zip code. So the I is much smaller than the we, and people are responding that it's in the national interest that we go back to the office. We need to the economy needs to recover. And even if I'm a bit nervous, I'm going to still do it because it's in the national interest. But in markets, first world markets, if you will, in Singapore, Hong Kong, I think our clients are beginning to expect a lot more controls, and they're being enacted, not only within offices, temperature taking, of course, all of the operational issues. Masks are there available for people if they don't have them in virtually every office. And people wear masks without the challenges the social challenges and the social evaluations that we face in the United States.
I might just pick up on the second part of your question there, because John answered that quite well, but just to pick up on your consumer point. So if I think about our retail experience, clearly that's been challenging to service customers face to face. In many markets, we've had to close branches, whether it was an external directive and or we've had an impact through the staffing. I think then again, reflecting, it's probably accelerated the retail digital experience so that a customer now expects to be able to complete their banking very much from, you know, their phone. And even our relationship managers, you know, have moved into a virtual servicing environment, which is interesting for APAC, which is very much a market that enjoyed still face-to-face customer service. I think the other side of it, if I think about Alex's world, is given the pressure on the retail market in terms of the change in tenant mix, it has afforded organisations such as banks access to different real estate locations that previously weren't available. The high end, especially in a market like Hong Kong, the high end retailer was very prominent, and with the stress on that industry, I suppose one of the positives, if I could use that term, from a retail lens is that we are have a broader range of portfolio decisions we can make now that the tenant mix in many of our hub markets is in a slight state of flux, if I consider the retail lens.
That's a great point. It's you know, not the sexy restaurant that, you know, everyone wanted a couple months ago. Now it's the credit tenant bank that could go in Main and Main. Is that what you're getting at, Shelley?
Yes. There's not as many Louis Vuittons in the mix anymore, I would say.
Lovely answer. Brad, you had a question come up from one of our audience?
Yeah, I wanted to turn it over to Simon Davis, who's also on the panel here. In the attendance here, sent me a text message, and I thought it was a great question to ask as well. Simon, are you around?
I'm not on camera because it's still just after 5 a.m. in Arizona, but good to see so many familiar faces.
I can't hear you, Simon.
Can you hear me now? Any better?
Yeah.
A little bit.
No, sorry, I've had some significant headphone issues. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you better now. Thanks, Simon.
Is that any better?
Much better.
All right, great. Just turning off the thing. It's weird, you know, conference calls these days, it's like a seance, right? Is anybody there? Can you hear me? Question I had, Shelley, good to see your face. I'm wondering, have you seen any like real positives come out of this sort of great work from home experiment through COVID? You know, personally, I know being home for the last 6 months has really helped me realign my priorities, and it's been great having so much time with my family and with my little girl, while still being able to put in the time. So I'm just wondering, from, you know, your perspective, have you seen any macro positives that have come out that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and it's been great to keep up with your journey while you've been remote. Good to hear from you again. I think perhaps maybe going back to my original opening, be careful what you wish for as a head of real estate, because this has accelerated our broader agenda, and what an organisation may have taken 3 to 5 years is here now. I think then it has allowed us to run the biggest flexible working experiment the bank has wanted to do, and in terms of benefits, it's allowed us to be very nimble in tweaking our approach to that agile solution for our customers. I think it's also demonstrated from a cultural perspective, for certain markets in Asia Pacific, working remotely perhaps wasn't as well received in terms of productivity and culture. And I think it has really challenged the norm and shown that as an organisation, with support and an enhanced experience, we can still provide a great customer experience for our end users, and also be able to support and drive business outcomes, even though we've changed our ways of working. So I think at a broad, view, it has helped shift the sentiment around how this way of working can actually enhance and drive outcomes for the organisation. And personally, I think, as you mentioned, it's allowed individuals to have greater control around their precious 24 hours a day and be able to be far more active in the way they work and how they work in terms of that structure. So I've seen a lot of benefit that way.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, Simon.
And it looks like we have a question in the group chat for everybody to hear. And so it's from one of our board members, Trip Ewan. So Alex, if you could answer this one. It's in Hong Kong, beyond COVID, how much has the geopolitics of Chinese control affected transactions and growth there? Is there a way to delineate between that and the COVID effect?
I don't want to get the easy questions. Yeah, look, it's a good and fair question. It is really hard to delineate between what's happening, and between COVID and geopolitical tensions. I mean, if you go all the way back to last year and the well-documented protests, actually, if you go a little bit before that, and obviously there are always going to be simmering tensions before you even get to protests, the market was already moving in a downward direction anyway. This year was forecast to come off like 10%, 15% if you look at sort of average rent. So that even makes it a lot more challenging to look at what effect geopolitical tensions have made to that sort of challenge of doing business in Hong Kong. And a couple of points that I'd make around that. We have seen little to no evidence of multinationals looking to up sticks and move back to home countries as a result. I think of probably the most well-documented move has been Vanguard upping sticks out of Hong Kong and heading directly across the border into Shanghai. So moved their offices from Hong Kong to Shanghai, which I think is a bit disappointing for Hong Kong, but perhaps is a curious move given current tensions. I think COVID's stopping people from doing deals. I think the US election is stopping people doing deals. And I think that one way or another, everybody's looking forward to the end of the year and being able to take a slightly longer term view on business as a whole, whether that's COVID or geopolitical challenges. There are a lot of bright sparks for Hong Kong. I mean, it's the one place, I've been here for 15 years. John's obviously been here for longer, and it's the one place I'd never bet against. Every time the market sort of comes off, within a quick period of time, it's rapidly moving in the other direction. And if we talk to our clients, whether they're originating from the US, the UK, Europe, they all have very strong growth plans for Hong Kong beyond the current challenges that we see over the next couple of years.
Great answer. Thank you, Alex. Well, I think that concludes our list of questionings that we have time for, and turn it over to Patty to bring us home.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate it. We wanted to, first of all, thank all of our panelists for participating. I know it's your evening, so good evening to each of you. And thanks to everybody who joined us early this morning for this session. Like John said earlier, it's our first session of the week. We have lots of great sessions planned over the next 3 days, so please join us if you can. I also wanted to mention just quickly a couple of upcoming events that Cornet has. First, on October the 8th, there's a virtual building tours and real estate strategy discussion for end users in the Triangle market, and they'll walk through newly constructed office spaces. And then on November the 5th, there'll be the virtual core awards will be taking place, and that registration will open up on Monday, October the 5th. So please sign up to participate in that. Our virtual world is challenging us to stay engaged, so we appreciate it. And thanks again. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you, John, Shelley.